Come along, let's go to Berry, way over in the Newberry ground. Sinner, don't you hear my Lord calling? Sinner, don't you hear my Lord calling? Oh, sinner, don't you hear my Lord calling? Way over in the Newberry ground. All the hammer people ringing in somebody coffin. The hammer people ringing, water boy, somebody coffin.
The Apalachicola River flows silently past Prospect Bluff. The sounds of nature and an occasional passing boat are the only disturbances to the quiet that envelops this place. 200 years ago, this was the scene of a bloody battle that ended with the deadliest cannon shot in American history.
According to eyewitnesses, it struck a tree, and I would assume that would be one of the tall longleaf pines that grew in this area. When it struck that tree, it ricocheted down into this octagonal citadel or center of the fort.
A hot shot from the American forces blew up Negro Fort and killed most of the inhabitants. Instead of a military operation, it turned into a rescue operation. And just hundreds of people killed in this horrible tragedy.
In a sudden flash of fire and destruction, 270 men, women, and children were killed. Pieces of their bodies were scattered across Prospect Bluff. Some were even found high in the tops of longleaf pine trees.
Battle-hardened men of the U.S. Army come up here and start crying visibly, and they're shaken, and clenched included. You get an idea just how massive and how they never experienced any of this, particularly with women and children and body parts all over the place. It was quite a traumatic event for everybody.
After the battle, the surgeon of the U.S. forces wrote that it was just a horrible scene. He said that there were bodies in the tops of pine trees, that he would see women and nearby their dead infants or dead babies. Most of the men were killed, most of the women were killed, and most of the children were killed in the explosion.
The story of the fort at Prospect Bluff is one of the most remarkable in American history. It was built by the British in 1814 and has been called many names: British Post, Negro Fort, Fort Negro, Fort Blunt, and finally Fort Gadsden.
After the Creek War, even though the war ended in 1814, some of the more recalcitrant Red Sticks fled to the supposed safety of Spanish West Florida and began to hide out in the woods and swamps there in the Pensacola area. This is why Jackson leads U.S. Army forces illegally November of 1814 into Pensacola area. And many of the Indians and runaway slaves fled further into the eastern panhandle, including Prospect Bluff area. And there were British interlopers. Remember, the War of 1812 is also going on at the same time as the Creek War. So we're fighting an internal war, and we're fighting the British. The British were the ones that set up the Negro Fort, brought in the refugees, the Creeks, the runaway slaves, and set up the fort at Negro Fort. And so what we have is a British-built fort in neutral Spanish Florida.
The fort was actually a very large complex. It covered multiple acres. There was the water battery, there was the central citadel, there were stockades that protected the flanks, there were moats, and then there was an outer breastwork and entrenchment as well. It was a complex, it was a well-designed fortification, and it's almost a fluke that what happened here did happen.
Lieutenant Colonel Edward Nicolls and Major George Woodbine brought British infantry and Marines to the fort. They used it as a supply depot and training post for thousands of Red Stick Creek, Seminole, and even a few Choctaw Indians. The fort at Prospect Bluff came to be called the Negro Fort because Nicolls and Woodbine formed and trained a battalion of Colonial Marines there. This battalion was formed primarily of escaped or captured African American slaves. The British offered them freedom in exchange for their military service. By the time Nicolls abandoned the post, he had formed a solid force of nearly 300 black Colonial Marines. They wore uniforms, took part in military drills, and were among the best trained troops on the Gulf Coast. The end of the War of 1812, however, spelled an end for the British intrusion into Spanish Florida. Nicolls and Woodbine left Prospect Bluff in May 1815. They withdrew most of their force of black Colonial Marines with them, but a company of around 80 remained behind with their wives and children.
Well, I guess not a whole lot is known specifically, but I'm assuming that they were much like the people that live around here today and come and see this site today. You know, they're people that just wanted to have a nice place to live, to be able to raise their children.
I've talked to people just in the last month, never heard of Prospect Bluff, or Fort Gaston, or as we know it, the Negro Fort. And they said, the Negro Fort, I never heard of it. I said, this was a fort that was built by the British, and when they abandoned it, they was taken over by maroons, and Cyrus and Prince and Gaston, and this was a fully armed fort, because when the British left, when the war was over, they just went back to England and left everything here.
For the period of time that the British fort was here, it was completely free and open society. And that was something that was highly unusual, and was also considered a high threat to the institution of slavery to the north and the American plantations and so forth.
The United States was unhappy with the occupation of the fort by a force of free blacks.
There, once you have the incident at Prospect Bluff or Negro Fort happen, then the United States realized that it had to do something to keep the economy going from Alabama and Georgia. So it suddenly became an international incident that the United States had to do something to keep that river traffic open.
In many ways, the settlement at Prospect Bluff could be called a maroon colony. Maroons were escaped slaves who formed free communities in the Caribbean region. Although North Florida is not part of the Caribbean, the inhabitants of Prospect Bluff lived in a similar way to the Maroons of Jamaica and other places.
There was a community around the fort. They had cattle, they was farming, and I think it was up to roughly 1,100 to 1,500 Maroons that lived around. It was an entire community. And they felt safe because they were under the protection of the Negro Fort, because a lot of the what you call bounty hunters or slave hunters would come down into Spanish Florida, even though it was a foreign country, and capture the slaves and take them back to their plantation and across the border in Alabama and Georgia for a reward, just like the Old West bounty hunters.
You have a unique aspect for the Maroon community that was here, free community in existence for about 2 years, and it became a beacon of hope for a lot of people who escaped and came here to seek freedom. And whether or not they stayed here and moved on, it was remembered for generations as sort of iconic for the symbol of freedom that it offered to people who were trying to get away from bondage.
A lot of people don't realize that the first Underground Railroad came south into Spanish Florida rather than north into Canada. And more came into Florida. One reason for it, the proximity. So why would you, if you were an escaped slave, go 900 miles up to Canada when you can go just a few miles across into Spanish Florida, which was a foreign country at the time?
Today we live in a pretty secure world. We don't understand that. We can't wrap our head around that. But people were literally living daily in fear of their lives. And so, you know, yeah, it would have been a very scary place to be, either side of the border. With the people who lived here or people who lived in Georgia, it would have been scary for either one.
The free settlement at Prospect Bluff was hampered by its isolation, lack of food, a temporary change in climate caused by the eruption of a volcano in the Pacific, and more. Yet it survived.
Well, there are a lot of resources out in the forest. There's lots of deer, other meat sources. They're right here on the river, fish all over the place. I'm not so sure about the soil in this area is not, you know, really good for growing things, but I'm sure they may do. And
By 1816, the farms of the inhabitants stretched for nearly 50 miles up and down the Apalachicola River. They carved fields and built homes on the land that today is some of the wildest and swampiest in Florida. To plantation owners and politicians in the United States, however, the fort at Prospect Bluff offered the greatest threat of their lifetimes. Fear spread that a free settlement of former slaves so close to Georgia would lead slaves across the South to escape or even revolt. The fear of hundreds of slaves fleeing the United States for Prospect Bluff was largely unfounded. Some of the fort's inhabitants did come from Georgia and the Mississippi Territory, but most had fled from owners in Spanish Florida. Major General Andrew Jackson, hero of New Orleans, was instructed by the War Department to seek out Spanish intentions regarding the fort. He did so and is often blamed for giving the order that it be destroyed, although he did not. The actual orders came from Major General Edmund P. Gaines, then commanding the Eastern Division of the U.S. Army's Department of the South. He sent Lieutenant Colonel Duncan Clinch to build a new fort near the border of Spanish Florida and asked the U.S. Navy to escort supplies for it past the fort at Prospect Bluff. Any attempt to resist this movement of U.S. supplies through Spanish Florida by the men at Prospect Bluff would be considered a hostile act and justification for an attack on the fort. Clinch arrived at what is now Lake Seminole on the border dividing Florida and Georgia in June of 1816. He built Camp Crawford, later to be called Fort Scott, and waited for news that his supplies and the Navy had arrived in Apalachicola Bay.
Clinch had never actually led any troops in battle until this battle. This is his first real war experience. And it's kind of surprising you find somebody with a high rank like he had at that time. He was a colonel. We find him what? No military experience? Yet he's sent to take care of this? Well, he had been sent on recruiting because he was a very persuasive, very handsome, and obviously a dominant man in many ways. And he wanted to fight. But he did have that in him, but unfortunately that didn't work out for him in the War of 1812. So as a result, he winds up being asked for this assignment, and he gets it down here.
The ships arrived on July 10, 1816.
And unfortunately, instead of turning out like a Fort Moselle, where they lived, a group of African Americans lived a untethered existence, they began to attack.
So the two boat parties, they were basically groups of sailors in small boats, rowed into the mouth of the river. One of them was commanded by Midshipman Loughborough. They took their boats up into the mouth of the river and began to paddle upstream. Not long after, Sailing Master Bassett on gunboat 149 saw a man standing here on the little piece of land or little island, sandbar at the mouth of the river. They rescued the man. Turned out that Loughborough's boat had been attacked. Garcon and the Choctaw chief had come down from Prospect Bluff with about 30 men. They drew in Loughborough's boat by having one man appear on the bank. Loughborough pulled over to investigate who this man was, and the Maroons and the Choctaws opened fire from along the banks of the river. Loughborough and several of his men were killed. Another one, Edward Daniels, was captured alive. He was later burned and tarred to death at Prospect Bluff. The survivor made his way downriver. They also picked up a body that was floating in the mouth of the river. And then this pretty much terrified the men who were on the gunboats.
Lieutenant Colonel Clinch, meanwhile, formed an alliance with two forces of Creek Indian warriors who were also on their way to attack the settlement at Prospect Bluff. They had been promised rewards for every former slave they could catch and bring back to the United States. Together the soldiers and warriors continued down the river, finally arriving near Prospect Bluff on July 20, 1816. Men from the 4th U.S. Infantry joined with Creek warriors under Major William McIntosh and Captain Isaacs to surround the land side of the fort. McIntosh and Isaacs carried forward a demand for surrender, but Garcon, the sergeant major in command of the fort, responded with a cannon shot.
They were were firing their heavy artillery at them. They were firing every gun they had. They also had Congreve rockets, and you can see the shell of one of these in the exhibit here at Fort Gadsden or Prospect Bluff today. These were rockets. They had a range of about a mile. They were a little bit wild. When they fired them, they would sometimes zig all over the place. But they could launch those at an enemy, and they were filled with explosives. They would explode when they got to where the enemy was. If you've heard, in the American or the U.S. national anthem, the line "By the rocket's red glare," these are the very rockets they were talking about. These Congreve rockets, and some of the ones here could fire 24-pounder shells on top of them, which could do a lot of damage if they hit you, obviously.
The British flag was raised over the fort, along with a red flag, symbolizing the intent of the men, women, and children there to fight to the death. The battle lasted from July 20th to July 27th of 1816. At 5 a.m. on the final day, sailing masters Jarius Loomis and James Bassett moved their gunboats to within range of the fort. Smoke and fire poured out over the river as solid shot and shells flew from the mouths of cannons.
In an instant, there was just a massive upheaval on this site where we're standing. The central citadel, for the most part, was leveled. There are still a few traces of the earthworks that you can see, and the moat is still intact in portions, or the inner moat is still intact in some places around this central citadel.
We were digging for the footers for the base of a boardwalk, and we found elements of the structure that was around the magazine. And it appeared, it was laying down, and it kind of appeared to have maybe have been, blown out the way the historic accounts are of the explosion of the magazine. So we actually saved part of that.
Of the estimated 320 or so people inside the fort when the explosion took place, the U.S. Army estimated that 270 were killed instantly in this explosion. We'll never know the exact numbers because there's just no way to know if they were estimates at best, probably based on the number of bodies they found after the battle. The surgeon of the U.S. forces wrote that it was just a horrible scene. He said that there were bodies in the tops of pine trees, that he would see women, and nearby their dead infants or dead babies. Most of the men were killed, most of the women were killed, and most of the children were killed in the explosion. Of the 50 or so prisoners that they took, about 18 died of their injuries shortly after the battle. That left a few less than 30 who actually survived, some of them badly injured and disabled, and they were carried back into slavery. Most, it turned out, had not come from the United States. They had come from Spanish Florida, primarily from Pensacola and St. Augustine, even though the United States at the time believed that the fort was a beacon to enslaved people on the southern frontier.
When Garcon admitted that he and his men had tortured and burned an American sailor to death, Clinch turned away as Creek warriors smashed his skull with axes.
After they talked to him, they allowed McIntosh's Creeks to execute him. They executed Garcon, his wife, and his child on the scene there where they were captured at the water battery.
2016 marked the 200th anniversary of the destruction of the fort at Prospect Bluff. It was a year of commemorative services, guided tours, and a major effort to upgrade the trails, boardwalks, and interpretive scheme at the site. The name of the park was changed from Fort Gadsden Historic Site to Prospect Bluff Historic Sites. The new name better reflects its multiple levels of history and the fact that it was the site of more than one fort. 2016 also appropriately proved to be a year of remarkable new discoveries at the site. Brush clearing operations and controlled burns rolled back 2 centuries of undergrowth and exposed parts of the fort that had previously been obscured from view. These included entrenchments, ditches, and a low rise that Forest Service archaeologists suspected might be the location of the mass grave of the victims of the 1816 explosion. There is a known cemetery at the site, but it is now believed to date from the U.S. military occupation of Prospect Bluff in 1816 to 1821.
So having no money and no resources, and we certainly weren't going to go digging into a potential cemetery, we started asking around, and some of our colleagues in the National Park Service had worked with search and rescue dogs that have special training with their handlers in locating human remains in archaeological settings, some quite ancient. And so Susie Goodhope, who's here today as a guest, came out with her dog Shiraz, and we worked over the area that looked questionable on the LiDAR, and we got some hits with a dog.
My cadaver dog, whose name is Shiraz, went back in the area, and Shiraz sniffs the ground and detects very minute signs of human decomposition. And when she does, she sits. So we went through the area and did a very tight grid through the area, and as we did, Shiraz, whenever she detected this odor, would sit, and we would mark it with a flag and then mark it with a GPS. We did this, and many months later, another friend of mine who has a cadaver dog named Lisa Higgins brought her cadaver dog Dixie, and we did the process again, using a second dog for verification. And Dixie alerted in the general area that Shiraz did. We had removed the flag, so it's a little hard to remember, but in the general area that Shiraz did. And now we come forward in time, and now they're using different modalities out here at the park to verify what the dogs have said. And we're out here today, hopefully, to see if the dogs were correct.
If the location detected by the dogs proves to be a mass grave, they and their handlers would have played a critical role in locating the burial site of the victims of the deadliest cannon shot in American history. Their work, combined with new research that is revealing the names of the Prospect Bluff inhabitants, may make it possible for the descendants of the victims to someday visit their grave site.
I think any time that you can give back to society an area that can be venerated from where souls have been lost, it's always a good thing. It's very good to have those folks who've been lost for years, to have a place, to have people to know where to come, if there are family members that are looking for their loved ones, and it really does make you feel very good.
Other new discoveries have resulted from a National Park Service project at the site, a project that brought together seasoned archaeologists from a remarkable variety of backgrounds.
First and foremost, our National Historic Landmark documentation is quite old. It's from the 70s, and we've not gotten any information to update that information. And one of the things that they like to look at is what was the overall footprint of the site. So not only do you have the obvious earthworks, and even the LiDAR image British fort outline that we can see on that, but interior features such as house floors, hearths, perhaps burials, activity areas, and from multiple time frames as well. We want to look at what happened on the British fort period, the American fort occupation, Seminole War, and even Civil War occupations here at the site.
Despite his years of experience in the field, archaeologist Mark Hubbs participated in the project as a student. He describes the findings as stunning.
I was with them when they did the above ground technology to see below the ground, but last night we did some analysis on that data that came out of those machines, and it was very clear. That area where the explosion took place, as they're referring to as ground zero, is filled with anomalies and features subsurface.
It was Hubbs who helped make another potentially groundbreaking discovery at the site. He recognized that several newly discovered earthen mounds were likely British field ovens.
They're essentially if you can imagine digging a round or circular trench about 2 feet deep, 3 feet wide, the inside edges being 16 feet apart in diameter. And then all the spoil is thrown up into the center to make a mound. And then on that inside edge, there would be 13 individual ovens dug into the inside of the trench. And each one of those ovens would service troops that occupied one tent, or one mess of soldiers, as we call it, 6 to 8 men. So that one oven, only 16 feet in diameter, could feed almost 100 men, a whole company of infantry, for example. But they're very rare in the archaeological record. I only know of one that's ever been dug archaeologically.
In addition to 3 possible British field ovens identified at Prospect Bluff, a 4th has now been found at the site of its sister fort, Nicolls Outpost, in Chattahoochee, Florida.
I guess this site is so unique and so exciting of a cross-section of history that people became intrigued by it, and one thing led to another, and this workshop happened. And we would not be able to do this without the the great efforts of the National Park Service and their willingness to partner with us on this as a partner agency.
The full report from the National Park Service is expected to provide the most archaeological detail ever revealed about the Negro Fort and later American post of Fort Gadsden. The 200th anniversary of the Maroon community at Prospect Bluff also provided time for a reassessment of some of the individuals involved in its history. Lieutenant Colonel Edward Nicolls, the British commander, is now recognized as a man who devoted his life to the legal ending of African slave trade.
Later in his military career, he served on the west coast of Africa when that international slave trade was illegal, and he confiscated a number of illegal slave ships for the British government and freed a lot of individuals. I think if you did the numbers, it was probably upwards in the hundreds of thousands of people, individuals he actually freed and sent back to Africa that didn't have to come to the New World and enter into slavery. That's a significant contribution.
Less committed to the cause of freedom was his second-in-command, Major George Woodbine. He went on to become something of a pirate before buying slaves and settling on a plantation in South America. He and his family were killed when their slaves rose up against them. Finally, there was Abraham, an enslaved carpenter from Pensacola. He joined the British Colonial Marines and arrived at Prospect Bluff as a soldier. He survived the 1816 explosion, but was captured by American forces. Taken to Georgia by Lieutenant Colonel Clinch, he soon returned to Florida, where he grew in status as an interpreter and leader among the Seminole people. He is now regarded as one of the most important African-American leaders of his day.
I think that any maroon, like myself, descendants of maroons, should be very proud of him, because before Martin Luther King and all these other people that we know about, he was in the forefront. For a black man during that time, it was inconceivable. And he spoke many languages. He also was in the Trail of Tears, the people that went west into Oklahoma.
Prospect Bluff is now protected and maintained as a public historic site by the U.S. Forest Service. Hope is growing that future research will tell us more about this remarkable American landmark. New interpretive panels and a new trail system lead visitors through the site. The story is told plainly and without bias.
A lot of people feel that our heritage has been stolen in a lot of places, so when we can find something to hang on to and identify this place as historical to Maroons and Black Seminoles, we can say, oh yeah, I remember that place.
Historian Dale Cox's book, The Fort at Prospect Bluff, is set for release this year. It will reveal a wealth of previously unpublished information on the history of Prospect Bluff, the British Post, and the Negro Fort. For more information on visiting Prospect Bluff historic sites, please visit 2egg.tv for links, additional video, and more information.
Come along, let's go to Berry. Won't you come along, let's go to Berry. Way over in the Newberry ground. Sinner, don't you hear my Lord calling? Sinner, don't you hear my Lord calling? Oh, sinner, don't you hear my Lord calling? Way over in the Newberry ground. Oh, the hammer keep a ringing in somebody coffin. The hammer keep a ringing.